This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
How useful is a more detailed setting?
Are my guts going to be eaten or not? That's what I want to know. I don't want to pine about the role of capitalism in space exploration.
If you're making the Firefly TTRPG, you're attracting Firefly fans. Those are the players that you're targeting.
The Grim Hollow Kickstarter is live. You should go check it out. There's a link down there and there's one up there.
Please support us so we can continue to feed our families.
D&D Beyond released a free one-shot adventure based on the 80s cartoon. If they did an 80s cartoon revival, would you watch it?
In true pedantic little nerd fashion, it's interesting that we're saying the most popular fantasy settings are these low magic settings from Game of Thrones, from Lord of the Rings, blah, blah, blah. Because...
all that and more right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the number one stay-at-home podcast in the world. That's right. When you're not feeling well, we are here to comfort you in times of need. Grab your hot chocolate or your coffee or whatever drink is yours of choice. Snuggle up on the couch, put your earbuds in, or crank up the radio because we're here to talk about tabletop RPGs predominantly. My name's Ben Byrne. If this is the first episode you're listening to, I am joined, as always, every episode by Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill. James Hake is out on assignment this week. They didn't pass away, don't worry. They're still with us, thank goodness. So I'm going to ask you, Dael, instead. This question coming in from Gethin. What is your favorite tabletop RPG setting?
Ooh, excellent question. I have a lot of love for the City of Mist given setting. It's really baked into the system of City of Mist by Son of Oak, but it's also just kind of a really vibey, like kind of gritty, like neon noir city setting. And also, this might be kind of a weird one. The setting of Paranoia really tickles me. It's not like deep world building or anything. Shawn is excited by that. Did I steal your answer? But the setting of Paranoia is delightful. It's so, I want to say like 70s sci-fi, but slapstick comedy at the same time. It's delightful. It is kind of baked into what you're doing. Friend computer is such a huge element, but it's not like deep world building seriousness. And I kind of love that.
Literally my answer. The Alpha Complex from Paranoia is pretty awesome too.
Yes!
Think of the Apple show, The Silo, mixed with Fallout, mixed with 12 Monkeys. And what Dael said is absolutely right. It's not deep, but that gives it exactly what it needs to be a great setting, which is the ability to expand upon it or change it. One of the first proposals I ever wrote and sent to a gaming company was to West End Games when they owned the rights to Paranoia. And I was going to set a source book and an adventure in adding two nodes to Alpha Complex, the education node for those young clones out there who needed to be educated, and the professional wrestling node. And we were going to have this whole thing, and it actually got approved, but then they ran out of money, and so it couldn't be made, and I was so sad. But
that's so sad.
I love that.
Been so good.
Yeah. Great game and a perfect setting for that game. But my real favorite one is whatever one I'm working on right now. Because it has to be. Right. So right now it's Grim Hollow and Strange Hollow because I'm working on those right now. A few months ago it was Crooked Moon. Great setting. Can't wait for that to come out. Next month, who knows what it'll be.
I was going to expand this question out as well. What is your favorite non-tabletop RPG setting? Doesn't have to be I should say. It can be a tabletop RPG setting. But if that restraint is kind of let go, what is a world you really love? And this, to be specific about the question, not the world you'd want to like quote unquote live in, because a lot of these stories that create drama to tell stories in, the world sucks and you wouldn't want to live there. More so, what is a world that you love either for the stories that are told there or the stories that you would want to tell there?
Look, off the top of my dome, I feel like there's got to be something that I just didn't think of in the moment. I'm going to really kick myself later. And I know it's coming for me, so I'm just going to have to accept it and move on. But the ones that came to my mind immediately, Dark Angel, which is a TV show from the early 2000s starring a young Jessica Alba, that was by James Cameron in some capacity. I think he produced it, created it. one of those things. But it's just an old-ish TV show that never quite got that huge cult following that it maybe deserves. There are some elements that are outdated, so if you go looking for it, just be wary that it's got to be very early 2000s sort of vision of a cyberpunk future. But it is kind of that really cool, like gritty sci-fi of the future, and they're all this spliced genetics sort of escapees from a government military scientific program, which I just am a total sucker for. One of the greatest opening scenes of any TV series ever. So that's the first one that came to mind.
I should go and check that out. I feel like I've heard of it because I've mentioned a few times just kind of offhand that my wife and I are watching Smallville at the moment, which is very like early 2000s and is an interesting time capsule of television because it started in 2001 and finished in 2011, I think, with 10 seasons. And it really changes across those 10 seasons. They're making references in the later seasons of stuff that hadn't happened when they started the show, But ever since we've been watching it, my wife is like, we should watch Charmed, or like we should watch Supernatural, or we should watch, any of those early 2000 shows.
But you should watch it.
I watched Charmed. I liked Charmed back in the day. Yeah,
that surprises me. But
yeah. I am not surprised at your surprise. And when my wife said we should watch it again, I was like, oh, that might be rough. That might be a bit of a rough rewatch.
I need you to imagine me stuck in a hotel because we weren't allowed on our flight out from Honolulu. So I'm stuck in a hotel where the TV, the only channel I can get to work, is playing Charmed. And it's one of those like finale episodes where everything's really dire and dark. And so there are like evil copies of them that just have like spiky dark black hair.
I remember this.
and big leather coats, and they just look super awkward, but that's the evil versions of them. And then they have a fight scene where they're just going, arrow. And as a Buffy fan, like I have such a soft spot for Charmed. I've watched it all, but it is really funny going from the fight choreography in Buffy to Charmed.
Buffy's another one that I should check out. I remember Wyatt standing on the bridge with his son, whose name I cannot remember. Evil Wyatt, this is, saying, "No, I will be forever grateful that you came back in time and stopped your brother from becoming good." And just like the
Chris,
reversal.
the brother Chris? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah.
Who I hated until, well, that's a spoiler.
Well, I feel like
will stop my sentence.
Anyway, before we devolve more.
Sorry.
No, this is a great question, though, because it goes to how settings are great. And the greater the setting is, the worse it is for role-playing games. Because I love Star Trek, but having a game set there doesn't necessarily, and I worked on the game, but it's hard to capture it in a game. I love Cthulhu-y stuff. The Laundry Files, if you've ever heard of a series of books called The Laundry Files, amazing. Cthulhu, but sort of James Bond, but bureaucratic nightmare. So like you have to fill out the form to be able to go stop this horrible creature from coming through right. So it mixes all of these genres in a way that's amazing. And I think there's even a game for it. I just don't know how you could pull it off.
We're swapping the order of things in this week's episode because folks have been asking for more listener emails than necessarily news. So we've got a listener email up front and then we'll dive into some news. But Gethin's larger question was about tying a tabletop role-playing game to a setting. Pathfinder is pretty closely, I mean, this is according to Gethin's email. I don't know this for a fact. Pathfinder fans, don't at me. Pathfinder is apparently pretty closely tied to Galari. The Witcher tabletop role-playing game, I can say, is pretty closely tied to the continent. They go out of their way to make a Witcher feel like a Witcher specifically in ways that like you couldn't reskin it easily to just be some other class or whatever. Whereas D&D has established settings and many of them, but the system, and I think there'd be great debate around this, doesn't necessarily tie itself to a single setting, or at least people hack it enough that they believe that it's not necessarily tied to a single setting. And apparently Dagger Heart, the Critical Role role-playing game, is claimed to be setting agnostic. It's not tied to any specific setting according to their rule set or influencing their rule set. Before we get to that question, though, I want to step back a little bit to what you were talking about, Shawn, which was how useful is a more detailed setting? Because there is a push and pull here, I feel, between making the GM do the heavy lifting and also a setting feeling a little bit like a shallow puddle in terms of like, I could do a lot of inventing here, but there's nothing like, why don't I just invent my own setting? There's nothing here drawing me to this setting specifically. And I think what you're talking about, which is the more defined you make a setting, the more difficult it is for you to feel the agency to be able to tell your own stories within that setting. If you want to play a game within the Star Wars universe, you may feel like you're kind of trying to play around the edges of established canon of Star Wars because that canon is so well ingrained within that specific setting. I would challenge the notion that it's better to have a less established setting for a role-playing game. I think it comes down in some capacity to GM preference in terms of giving them lots of interesting things to play with and still making them feel like there is the freedom to change the order of those things or reshape those things or add their own things within that setting. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And for me, it's a matter of immersion versus utility. If you make your rules very specific to this setting, you are taking this part of the machine and this part of the machine and you're doing this. And now if you don't like this setting or if you want to change this setting, you have to pull this machine apart and you're left with half a machine. Whereas if the full machine is built for you to take things and plug it into, then you are able to have more flexibility. I talk about this with the Alien role-playing game. Alien, obviously based on the great movie and the great series of movies that have come since then. What is Alien about? Alien is about finding this strange ship floating through space, going into it because you're told by a corporation that you have to, and getting your guts eaten. That's what Alien's about. You can put a chassis around that, and you can say, oh, it's really about commerce and it's about these things. But when you sit down to play a game of Alien, you're really like, okay, are my guts going to be eaten or not? That's what I want to know. I don't want to pine about the role of capitalism in space exploration in the 22nd century, right? It's just like, am my guts going to get eaten? Boy, I hope so, because that's what I like about this game. You can sit down and you can play an adventure or a campaign in Alien, but I think you're going to get less buy-in on this longer term campaign than the short version, if that makes any sense.
Sure. It's interesting to me. I mean, look, full disclosure, I haven't really seen many Alien movies, but it was interesting to me the example you used was pining over the destructive capabilities of capitalism, or to paraphrase you, because isn't that kind of part of the themes of Alien is like the aliens keep getting loose because, a corporation is trying to figure out a way to monetize this monster?
Exactly. But how often is that going to come up? We play once a week for 2 years. How much time are we going to spend discussing that topic? And if you make rules about, okay,
Ben's
we're hauling this,
pining about the plight of capitalism in the 22nd century.
Exactly. No, but if you make the game about we need to get the cargo from point A to point B, that's fine, I guess, if you want to make a game about hauling cargo from point A to point B. But is that the game that the people who come to this every week want to play? Oh, well, let's see. Let's chart out our course and how we are going to get, this deuterium from here to here, whatever. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to stop burying the lead in some capacity, my favorite role-playing setting, if it's not obvious, is Grim Hollow. And when I joined Ghostfire, it kind of naturally fit together because Grim Hollow takes inspiration from a lot of my other favorite media, if not settings, such as The Witcher and Castlevania and Berserk and those sort of places. But what I try to imbue Grim Hollow with in some capacity, and when we started working on the Grim Hollow Transformed project, I wanted to boil down into too many core pillar themes. There are too many of them, but I couldn't boil it down further, of like what Grim Hollow is to me and what it should offer to other players. And that's not to dictate all it can be and only what it is, but just to have a direction to thematically push in for writers and be able to communicate easily to GMs what it's kind of offering them in terms of easy to pick up tools that can help them capture the same sense of theme at their table. Because for me, like, to use the Alien setting again, just very quickly, I think the reason I would want to play Alien, because I'm a role player and I'm, you know, a storyteller, and I prefer to play in themes necessarily than play with mechanics. Yeah, let's explore how capitalism has effed us through the apparatus of this monster that is hunting us. You know, capitalism has literally become a monster that is now hunting us through the ship. But we're going to, there's going to be more going on here than just the monster. There's going to be something that we're trying to accomplish is diametrically opposed to the themes or the ideals that brought this monster onto the spaceship in the first place. So we have to get rid of it, we have to jettison all of our valuable cargo. And we're not going to make any money on this flight anymore, on this journey that we've made. But the only way to survive is to reject capitalism, right? Is like the thematic foray that I would want to explore in an Alien game. And then create characters where you have people that are like, I really don't want to jettison our cargo. That seems like a bad idea. Or like, maybe there's a way to try to monetize this creature ourselves or take advantage of the situation and see how that plays out, you know, for better or worse.
This is the most Ben answer ever.
Yeah. And I really think that's a great idea for about 3 sessions. Now,
Sure.
now if the game got into what the corporations are now hunting you, it would need to expand out to become more than it actually is in order to support the kinds of stories.
You mean mechanically, the game would need
mechanically,
to
right?
Then you pull out the Firefly RPG core rulebook and start stealing bits of its setting.
Exactly. Because now you're getting into Star Trek territory for me, and so you need to expand out to make that something that people will want to come back to. People who aren't Ben will want to come back to week after week after week.
Well, there's also the balancing act, which I'm very cognizant of, right? Which is the fact that if you create an overly complicated story, the players just won't follow it. Because what the GM has in their head, you know, they might have all the pieces, but the players don't have all the pieces. They're only being given those pieces for 3 hours a week. They're not being given every piece, every session necessarily. And so they're not seeing the whole puzzle. And so when you're like, and this character arrives and everybody at the table goes, who? Like, what? Did we remember them from like 8 sessions ago? So there is that balance between being able to explore theme, but not overcomplicating your narrative or your world setting in a way that makes it difficult to follow and play in a long form campaign.
Yeah, well, that's kind of, it connects with what my immediate thought was about, you know, games that have a lot of setting locked in and games that are more setting agnostic. Is that on either end of the spectrum, you can overwhelm players who are coming to your game. Usually, if you're dealing with a property that has been made into a TTRPG, I don't think it's as much of a problem, because if you're making the Firefly TTRPG, you're attracting Firefly fans. Those are the players that you're targeting. So it's a little bit less of an issue there. But there are a lot of games like City of Mist, or on the other end of the spectrum, you know, your GURPSs or Fates, where you are appealing to a group of just random TTRPG players out there as an audience who might buy your product. And you're saying, here's the depth of lore of my setting. You have to read, there's a whole chapter at the start where you have to learn what's going on here. And that can be really overwhelming for people. Or on the other end, you can say, use this to play whatever you want. And a lot of people find that really overwhelming because now it's all on them. And so you kind of, it is, I completely agree with what you said at the top of the question, that it's not just that one option is good and the other one is bad. It's a very complex kind of delicate system of what different sub-audiences within TTRPG players want and find appealing. Because it can be, like was mentioned already, it can be a ton of work to rip out the system from a setting, and then now you have to rebuild whole portions of the system. But it can be just as much work kind of investing your players in a setting that you're making up from scratch. And I don't know whether I have a specific preference. I think a lot of people do find it inspiring when there is something to build from. And I think that's kind of the realm that D&D might sit in, really, is this zone where it's like, yeah, it's not locked into a setting, but clearly there are setting elements that bleed in through the class design and the species design and things like that mean that you do get those little sparks of inspiration that you can build from. Because you do know, oh, well, this setting does have elves and dwarves. And even though that's only something small, that is a setting element that is true. Maybe not if your DM says no elves and dwarves, but you get what I'm saying.
That's what I find interesting about hearing that Daggerheart is claiming to be setting agnostic, because their species are so very specific. Elf, dwarf, gnome, orc to some capacity are kind of like these core Tolkien-esque, if you will, fantasy species that I feel are expected to be in most fantasy role-playing games, unless you're going for something really specific, perhaps. But Daggerheart kind of introduces like cat people and bird people and turtle people and like all these different kind of player species that are very, very flavorful, which is a positive. But as someone whose favorite setting is this, he's pointing at Grimhollow for the audio people, I look at Daggerheart and I'm like, I don't immediately see, I'd have to do more investigation, but I don't immediately see how I can adapt that setting without just cutting out half
because
the species.
Because it feels more Redwall, it feels more Roots, it feels more, I do completely agree with that. And it's interesting seeing their approach to that versus MCDM's approach with Draw Steel, where they have literally just gone, look, no, you don't have to play in our setting, but we have to design from a specific point that we're all on the same page with. So we're just going to use our setting, the internal Matt Colville Auden setting, as our design point of origin. And you can keep what you want and chuck what you don't. But there are going to be elements of that propagate outwards regardless of whether you play in their given setting. Those setting elements cling in a different way. And it really becomes a question of genre, right? Because when you're saying, oh, it's setting agnostic, but there are elves and dwarves and whatever,
sure.
You're starting to toy with the idea of, okay, but it is a fantasy genre game. What elements of setting, because you can have fantasy without elves and dwarves, but we're getting into a point where we're starting to say that those are fantasy genre tropes that become the only important, you know what I mean? And it starts to spread, and these little animals that become warriors. That is a fantasy fable element of genre. I don't know. It's all very interesting.
Yeah, and I think the same is true for 5e in ways where like the spell slot system and the way spells are cast and having cantrips is a very specific system of magic.
That's a really good point.
That I think that people have kind of peeled back a lot, like when I run Grimhollow and I'm talking to my players and it's meant to be a low magic setting, I will say like, yeah, you can cast cantrips, but you are virtually the only ones, in a 20-mile radius necessarily at any given point. It's not like there's a cleric in every chapel who can just heal you. You are special because you have those features. When they were talking about the new rules for 2024, and they were like, we want the dwarf to be the dwarfiest dwarf that ever dwarfed, and we're going to give him more rock powers and that sort of thing, that begins to feel less setting agnostic and more kind of specific to a sort of Forgotten Realmsian or maybe Greyhawkian kind of setting. So I think that the setting tropes or the setting kind of context clues within the 5e system are definitely there. Folks just like to ignore them more because, I don't know, somehow they are inherently more hackable, I think. I've played other systems where the magic system feels really tied to the setting, where it would be really difficult to disentangle it and try to use it setting agnostically. But I can't say that that's more or less complex than like the 5e spell slot system necessarily, right? So maybe it's just attitude or perspective.
Yeah, well, I mean, the 5e magic system has come from the 4e magic system and the 3e magic system and the 2e magic system and the D&D magic system, which has evolved over time to be a popular choice that has evolved organically. People like to be able to cast spells at will, but then they also like to be able to cast these larger things, but they don't want to be able to cast them all the time. So it's sort of worked its way through a system, has nothing to do with setting, that has to do with playability,
Sure.
which is a whole other aspect of this discussion that we probably should not get into at this point.
Well, I hope that's at least, because I know I muddied the waters there on Gethin's question a little bit, but I hope that's at least in somewhat answered his question. Speaking of settings, as I've alluded to a couple times, the Grim Hollow Kickstarter is live. You should go check it out. There's a link down there and there's one up there, and we're really excited. And thank you everyone who's backed so far. I'm very nervous. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm excited. And you'll watch me slowly lose my mind even further as the night gets later.
And I will quickly lose my mind, so you can just stop in for a few seconds to see that, point and laugh, but I'm used to it. It's all good.
How are you feeling about it, Shawn? You seem pretty calm and collected. How are your hands? They're not trembling at all?
Not from nerves about that, no. I'm very excited about it, but this is new for you, Ben, in the sense that you were more involved and continue to be more involved in the design of this. And so I can completely understand why you might be a tad more nervous than in previous ones. This is now just like, please support us so we can continue to feed our families and, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Every pledge supports this podcast in a way. So,
Sure.
Cool. So go check it out. Why not? I'll post the link to the Kickstarter one more time. Woo! Look, getting excited. Speaking of exciting things and last minute blink and you'll miss it news, the Legends of Vox Machina, the TV show, the animated TV show from Critical Role, which was on Amazon Prime, is on YouTube, the first 2 seasons in their entirety, entirely for free until October 3rd. So I just thought I would shout this out because if you catch this podcast in time and you don't want to sign up for Amazon Prime, but you're curious about the show, it's worth a watch. If you're a fan of Castlevania or any of those fantasy shows.
It's a very smart marketing move. It's a really clever move. They should do, what they should do is the Power Rangers YouTube channel just has like 3 live streams going constantly that are just 24-hour loops of specific series of Power Rangers.
Sure.
I'm revealing my nerd badge at the moment, but they should do that with the Legends of Vox Machina because they'll catch people. People will see it and go, "Wait, what's this?" Oh, and they'll end up getting stuck and watching a couple episodes, and then they'll go, "I want to watch the rest of it." It's a smart move.
Would you recommend Legends of Vox Machina, Dael, while it's free on YouTube?
Oh, well, it's free on YouTube for sure. That sounded whoa. What I'm saying is, if you are not someone who has already found yourself intrigued and interested and captured by the advertisements, the trailers for Legends of Vox Machina, while it's free, go try a couple episodes, go check out that Ghoul episode from season 1. See what they have to offer. See if maybe you would like it. I'm just saying, take advantage of free stuff while it's there.
Do it. Yeah, it's a time. We've talked about it on this. One of our most highest performing shorts on the Lorecast YouTube channel is Dael describing Scanlan's poop. No, it wasn't Scanlan's poop. It was the other guy's poop.
I forgot. Yeah, when he stands up from the toilet. No.
We just got another short out of this by splicing it with the old one. It's a time. It's a vibe. It's a little bit different from something like Castlevania, but it's worth checking out while it's free on YouTube for sure. And then seeing if you want to carry on with some Bezos bucks. Speaking of free things, D&D Beyond released a free one-shot adventure based on the 80s cartoon. It's called Uni and the Hunt for the Lost Horn. Free one-shot based on the 80s cartoon. You can use the pre-generated characters if you want at 4th level, which are the characters from the cartoon who have been aged into young adults, including the titular Uni, now a fully grown unicorn. Is this the Venger adventure we were promised? I'm confused.
I think so. I think that when that was mentioned way back when, that this was what they were referring to. And it's sort of odd because we've gotten mixed messages. At first, this was going to only be played at conventions and at a few game stores. Right. I was like, oh, it would have been nice to see that. And then it's like, oh, get it for free on D&D Beyond. I was like, okay, cool. I've downloaded it. Looks good. I have not run it. Teos, who oversaw the running of D&D at PAX West, PAX Prime, ran it and oversaw that and said it's amazing and people loved it. And Teos would never lie to us, so
great,
got to be true.
Trusting you, Teos. This was just some, pardon me, speculation that I saw on an article when I was reading about this. I apologize, I can't remember which article it was specifically, but talking about how there's been a lot of kind of like little pokes and nods and pull references back, if you will, to the 80s cartoon in the recent 2024 Player's Handbook, and now this, and they appeared in the D&D movie as an Easter egg. And we talked last week about how Strahd kind of has that iconic mascot kind of vibe for D&D as a character that people can really connect to and think of Strahd when they think of D&D. If they did an 80s cartoon revival, kind of like the He-Man revival they did on Netflix, would you watch it?
I don't remember the He-Man revival. I mean, I remember the She-Ra revival.
I think maybe that's what I'm... Oh, no, I feel like there were two separate ones.
Yeah, no, I feel like if they went in that kind of direction, look, I'm a sucker for like an X reboot, right? Like a gritty reboot. I'm a sucker for we've re-envisioned this thing. So I think there is a good chance that it would work on me. But the other thing that is interesting is that because I'm a 90s baby, you are too, right?
Yeah.
But
well, not really.
I only have attachments to 80s properties that happened to be like recorded on VHS, like hit the record on the VCR so that they could get a recording of whatever block of children's shows was on that my older siblings were watching. And then now you have a tape of those shows. So I have, in my bones, I grew up with like half an episode of Gummy Bears. You know what I mean? Like I have some
the
attachments.
Mario TV show.
I have some attachments to 80s stuff, but not all of it. Like my Ninja Turtles was definitely the late 90s, early 2000s Ninja Turtles, not the heroes in a half shell, Turtle Power. So there's that kind of element. So I do wonder whether I would have as much room in my heart for it as otherwise would potentially be there. And I wonder how this is going to go, because calling it uni and the hunt for the blah, blah, blah is an interesting play, because it feels like it's simultaneously targeting a very young audience and an audience of very specifically people who watched this show when it was there in the 80s, which maybe that works. Maybe those people have young kids and it's playing into that idea of parents who are nerds push their nerddom onto their children. Mm-hmm. So maybe that'll work really well for them, but then it might be missing kind of that in-between audience. Yeah.
This cartoon came out at the worst possible time for me because I was a teenager who was super into D&D. And so looking at this, I was like, oh, this isn't D&D. This is for kids. This is trash. And of course it wasn't, but I was. So this is coming out for people who were younger than I was, or old enough to maybe have kids or beginning to have kids that they could share that with. And now is the time when they are retiring, as someone said in chat, taking the thoughts right out of my head, right? They're retiring now. They have kids or grandkids it's perfect for them. So let's get them, hooked in this way. So when I watch it, absolutely. When I watch it critically, no, I wouldn't.
Yeah, fair enough. For clarity, there was the She-Ra cartoon, but then separately Netflix did, it was called Masters of the Universe, Revelation, which got a season back in 2021.
I just completely missed it.
Yeah, I watched the first episode. I was like, eh.
Wouldn't say you missed. That's funny. Bagsy saying nostalgia is one of the most reliable sources of money for a product like this, and that is so very deeply, deeply true. And it's probably purely because I was not one of those people grabbed by it. I don't have the nostalgia for it, but I do wonder how far the nostalgia can carry the D&D cartoon. Someone tell me, because I am being Australian and being a little bit too young for the 80s D&D cartoon. Someone tell me how popular this cartoon actually was? Like, what level of heights did it reach of success in its original run?
It's hard to say. I think it was on Saturday morning, so it was on amid a bunch of other cartoons. And this was before the internet. This was before nobody, I mean, if you watched it, you watched it. If you didn't, you didn't. It wasn't like there were people talking about it or wearing D&D clothing, right? Like Bugs Bunny or something like that. So it didn't reach those heights, but it came at a time when D&D was in the news for good reasons or for the reasons that we all know as the Satanic Panic. So, it had its place, but I can't like point to Nelson ratings and say it was watched by 2.7 million households per week.
Right. But okay, so it's a little bit like, I did watch Doug whenever Doug was on, but it's not that I liked Doug, it was just on.
Speaking of things that are on, sales of the new Player's Handbook 2024 are definitely on. According to Wizards of the Coast, it is the Player's Handbook 2024 is the fastest selling D&D book of all time. It has surpassed Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, which was the previous record holder, and it has sold 3 times, apparently, the 2014 Player's Handbook did in its first week after it was launched. No specific numbers are being given on what is actually sold. I don't really care about specific numbers. There was a little bit of a kerfuffle, if you will, on YouTube and across Twitter and various news sites about how the book scan data, which only represents big box stores as far as I understand, had only sold 3,000 copies and that only 3,773 copies of the Player's Handbook had been sold up to this point. You wouldn't trust book scan data because it doesn't account for the main places that these books would be selling, which is through Wizards of the Coast directly or through local hobby shops, which are not accounted into book scan for the most part, to my understanding.
Does anyone account for Amazon?
We don't know if Amazon accounts for Amazon because they may be counting it as the 2014 Player's Handbook. It's a big mess. And what it comes down to is we don't know how well it's selling. Wizards, their information is probably in the stratosphere of true, but there are no specifics. And then there are people going out of their way to try to disprove that it's selling, which is ridiculous because who cares? If it's selling, it's selling. If you don't want to play it, don't play it. It's an odd thing. All I can say is that selling 3 times the 2014 Player's Handbook isn't a big brag because in 2014, a small percentage of the players that are playing now were playing. So to say that it's great. I mean, I'm glad it's selling and I'm glad that Wizards of the Coast was proud enough to put this out. That tells me that they're probably happy. I'm not like, everyone in the world is playing 2024 D&D right now. Sure. But also, it's not that no one is playing it. And I also heard that, nobody's going to buy that book. Really? Not one person? Not one person is going to buy the book, huh? I have 2 sitting right over there. So I know that it sold at least 2.
Right over there.
3. It sold 3, at least 3.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to wade too much into the discourse because I don't necessarily think we need to play the role of media watch in the tabletop RPG sphere. We get stuff wrong from time to time as well.
Lies. We don't get things wrong.
We're never wrong. I Maybe One in chat said the headline was D&D product, not books. No one knows how many digital copies. That's true. I think I remember, maybe we even talked about it on this podcast a couple of weeks ago, that they had said more than half of pre-orders for the new Player's Handbook were on D&D Beyond as the D&D Beyond kind of module. Somebody can fact check me on that if that's not true, but I imagine a large swath of sales so far are through D&D Beyond. And Roman saying that they have the D&D Beyond version but can't find a physical copy in Oz yet. I believe they were delayed till October. So that is why you haven't been able to find a physical copy in Australia, is because they're not arriving here, I don't think, until the 11th of October, going off the top of my head. You might be able to find them at PAX. DnD, in quotation marks, is at PAX. it's not marked as Wizards of the Coast on like the PAX, what are they called, vendors or whatever. It's just marked as DnD. So, but I assume they may be selling copies of the Player's Handbook there.
But probably not copies of the special edition.
No, but I wouldn't be surprised if maybe some of the other vendors that like, because PAX Australia has a lot of like game stores, local game stores that come and do stalls and they bring product themselves. I wouldn't be surprised if some of them showed up with a special edition. I'm not making any promises though, so don't say, Ben told me I can go to PAX and get a special edition of the Player's Handbook, because that's not what I'm saying.
There's also been folks in chat wanting us to call out, and they are right, the sort of launch of Wild Mage Press, which it's a kind of magazine in the style of things like Arcadia or the one from Icarus Press that is founded by Hannah Rose and Clara Daly. I just wanted to say, best of luck to that, because I think that's a really cool product and I think they're very cool people and I'm excited to see the kind of stuff that they make.
And we covered over on Mastering Dungeons this week, so go check it out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, go hang out with Mastering Dungeons every week. The best 2-3 hours of content collectively. Don't you do 2 hours on Mastering Dungeons? Kind of 1 hour for news and 1 hour for...
Yeah, well, it's supposed to be like an hour, and then we usually go an hour and 45 minutes. So,
Gotcha. Okay. As we're increasingly finding ourselves here. But before we run out of time, let us jump onto another listener email. Shawn, where can people send their emails?
They can go to podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. And if you do, Ben will drop something and make a funny noise.
I'm sorry, I'm a fiddler. I've got my pen here that I'm playing with. Yes, you can go to podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. This one coming from Anton, and this kind of, maybe thematically ties into the conversation we were having earlier. Is there a mismatch between what the majority of players expect, there's an assumption at the start of the question, and want from their fantasy RPGs versus Dungeons & Dragons? But D&D is simply the default established RPG and so attracts all the players despite the mismatch of expectations. The most popular fantasy media shows tend to be, as asserted by the question, low magic, such as Game of Thrones, Lord of the Rings, arguably the Witcher TV show, although its popularity may be a little bit questionable. Rings of Power, is that high magic? I don't even know. And then my editorializing on the end here, does lower magic lead to more intuitive storytelling? Is D&D 5e the right system for low magic games? I can't remember if I added that or that was in the question. I apologize. But Dael, you want to start off, so you start. Get us going.
Well, in true pedantic little nerd fashion, I do have to begin by saying it's interesting that we're saying the most popular fantasy settings are these low magic settings from Game of Thrones, from Lord of the Rings, blah, blah, blah. Because that is focusing on cinematic and televisual representations of fantasy, right? And I do have to say, I think there's actually not as much overlap in the TTRPG player base and the sort of fantasy TV show and film base as people might expect. I think far more of the audience for TTRPGs and fantasy TTRPGs are coming from nerds who read fantasy books primarily, and then nerds who play fantasy video games. I think those are far and away the more likely kind of funnels for people towards this kind of game. And I would possibly argue, I'd probably need to actually do research before I'd stand by it and die on a hill for it. But I would wager that the settings in video games that are fantasy and the settings in books that are fantasy are probably, we're getting that percentage of high magic rising up a little bit there, would be my first thought.
And where are a lot of the tables or the video role-playing games that we talked about, that you talked about last week? Where did they originate? They originated with D&D and with the aesthetics and with the gameplay that D&D brought. So everything Dael said, I'm looking at my notes and it's right there. Right. I'm having trouble with the premise, and Dael explained exactly why.
I think part of the popularity of Game of Thrones to a broader audience who aren't or don't typically think of themselves as fans of fantasy is because Game of Thrones was kind of the Sopranos set in a fantasy world, right? Like the relationships and the politicking and the strategy kind of on an geographical sense, were more important than the magic, the dragons in the early seasons, the White Walkers, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the fact that a lot of fantasy shows have kind of failed to capture a similar audience, although have tried to, again, I don't know that I'd die on this hill, but I would pontificate whether it is because the higher magic makes audiences that were attracted to Game of Thrones kind of be like, nah, I can't buy into that. It just seems silly to me,
And in role-playing games, what do players want to do? They want to maybe tell a story, maybe get into character, but for the most part, they want to roll dice and blow things up or hit things hard with their sword. And so you need high magic in order to express that, in order to give people something to do. It goes back to the alien discussion we had earlier, where we want, as a game, this stuff to happen, not to set and track out our ratio of fuel per credit earned. So that goes into it as well. And I know Dael wants to say something, so I'll be quiet now.
No, basically just backing you up. It's that thing. It's when you play a game, you want different things to be happening to when you are watching a movie or reading a book. In a book in particular, you've got a lot of room for light and shade, for pacing to have slow points, to have, exciting fever pitch moments. And you have a lot of room when you are deliberately sitting yourself in the space of audience member. You have a lot more sort of forgiveness for those finer details of like the politicking that you were mentioning. Like you have a lot more room to be absorbing in that capacity. But if you are sitting yourself down and saying, I am a participant in this activity, you want to do stuff. You want to have an impact on what's happening. You want to engage with the world and see the effect of what you're doing. And so I think that's a really important element of difference there, is that you sit down to play D&D, and a lot of players, they want to play the wizard. It doesn't matter that it's more complicated. It doesn't matter that it's, it's because the idea of I can cast fireball, that is an important element of kind of the player brain. It's really interesting. There's a Netflix series called High Score, which is just kind of a mini docu-series talking about the development of video games. And it has its strong episodes and its weaker episodes, but there's at least one episode where they really focus on the way that tabletop role-playing games and video games were developing alongside each other and really influencing each other in really strong ways. And it actually, in a separate episode, this is just a fun fact, in a separate episode, it has Janelle Jacquet's wife, but just for a different thing. And I didn't realize, and then I looked it up and I was like, wah. So that's just fun. But no, there's this idea of these games are just directly influencing each other because the people who are playing one are developing the other, and vice versa. And so that leads to this kind of, and also, frankly, if I were to make an argument for it, it would be that the geek set, there's an element of that as a culture that is more embracing of that delight in sort of childish fun, right? That other people had left behind. So if you're a geek, you don't need to be convinced to watch the show about dragons. But if you're going to get the jocks to like your show about dragons and magic, you disguise it as gritty and cool and low magic and blah, blah, blah. It's really about all this other stuff. But also there just happen to be dragons, but that's like, it's not a big part of it. You know what I mean? And so I think there's that element kind of playing into it as well. But I don't know. It just keeps coming back for me that I don't think the audience of Game of Thrones are the target audience of TTRPGs like D&D.
To the second part of the question, is D&D 5e the right system for low magic games? I wanted to talk to that because I think it depends on what you want out of your game and world. The reason that we use 5e in 2024 5e now for Grimhollow is because one of the core tenets of Grimhollow, there's horror, there's the world is dangerous, the gods are dead, there's darkness and obscurity. Nobody knows or understands how anything works necessarily. But one of the core tenets of Grimhollow is hope. and this idea that like you're not going to change the world necessarily, but what's that old quote? To save one life is to save the world, or something like that. And we want players to feel empowered to be able to go and make change in the world. If you look at The Witcher, Geralt is an incredibly capable character, and so is Yennefer, within a dark fantasy world. And even if you look at Berserk, which is even grittier and more kind of intense, Berserk is like, or Guts, the character, I should say, sorry, is like almost committed the cardinal Berserk sin of calling the main character Berserk. Guts is incredibly, like almost superhumanly capable because of the way they've trained their body and mind to the absolute pinnacle of human capability, which represents what a 5e barbarian or fighter might feel like in a low magic setting. It's more about the players have all the tools, as I was saying earlier, to be able to bring a lot of power into the world. But that doesn't mean the world around them is necessarily filled with power, or that power is benevolent if it exists. So there's, on the DM, using the system to kind of world build and being choosy where you put the pieces of high magic to make the world feel dangerous.
Low magic need not mean low power. And
Sure.
if you have that power, there is a consequence for using it in a world that doesn't necessarily trust or accept it.
I really love the dragons in Game of Thrones. I feel like it's probably not the Witcher TV series. Maybe it's a video game. I've seen this before, but I do love when magic feels powerful and dangerous and somebody casts lightning bolt and it just blasts people to pieces in a Dr. Manhattan style. Like that's evocative. That feels dangerous. That feels high fantasy in a way because somebody just evoked lightning to their fingertips, but it doesn't feel bouncing castle D&D, which is the slightly prejudicial term I use to refer to Forgotten Realms D&D.
Well, no, that's really interesting because we're using these terms very willy-nilly, high fantasy, low fantasy. But it is worth bringing up that those terms aren't concrete. They might mean different things to different people, and they're not the only. It's not a binary, right? Like I often avoid using the term high fantasy or low fantasy. I say pervasive magic, right? Like you can have something be gritty high fantasy, or you can have something be low fantasy that is not gritty. Like there's a whole sort of spectrum of things going on. It's not just one flip switch. And so that makes a lot of difference as well. And then on top of that, like I've been talking very broadly about sort of broader audience expectations, saying, oh yes, well the broader audience wants that more high magic setting, but that doesn't account for all the pockets of people who love different things. The Grim Hollow setting is so beloved by such a fervent group of people who like that specific vibe. And so again, it comes back in some ways to that idea that Wizards of the Coast are playing a different game to a lot of us in terms of business, because they are deliberately trying to court the sort of, for lack of a friendlier term, lowest common denominator. They're just trying to get the broadest audience possible. Whereas the rest of us, apart from there are obvious like other downsides going on, but you get the kind of benefit of being able to target more specific groups within that wider audience.
You bring up Firefly earlier, and that's a great example of this setting that cannot be categorized, right? It's science fiction, but it's not that high lightsaber science fiction, but it has magic, right? It has this sort of, who was the character that the character Summer Glow played?
River. Yeah.
Right. She could do magic. And
essentially.
It was, it wasn't, but it was. And so it bent all of these genres into something unique that you can't categorize, but it can still be fun. And the game that came from it could be fun.
Genre is very fluid. I find it difficult to describe dark fantasy to people. I was on a podcast just recently, just this last week. It's cool. It's from the YouTube channel Eneth Strife, ENOTHE space Strife. You can go check it out. Great dude, interviewed a couple of people, but thought I'd call it out because I mentioned something there that's relevant to this conversation, which is I referred to dark fantasy as the new metal of fantasy genres because I think it pulls a little bit of different things from different places, and my specific taste of it, is specific in ways that that's that's pulling on too many horror tropes for it to feel right to me, and this is too high magic, but this is too low magic, and as new metal kind of pulls on rap and R&B and metal without being full kind of headbanging music constantly, and classic rock and all these different places to form this new genre. I think dark fantasy has kind of done the same. Dark fantasy, not necessarily descriptive of low magic. You might mean different things when you're referring to low magic versus dark fantasy versus grim dark versus, any other genre. So genre is fluid.
In genre theory, there's a concept called fuzzy sets. So by Brian Atterbury, if people want to look into it deeper, Brian Atterbury, fuzzy sets.
Speaking of fuzzy sets, I'm going to answer one more podcast question here, emailed to Ghostfire podcast, podcast at ghostfiregaming.com. Sorry, again, can't talk today, only because it's a quick question. Matthew asked, Polymorph and temporary HP. The 2024 Polymorph spell gives the target temporary HP equal to the beasts that they're transforming into, but do those temporary HP or hit points last after the spell ends? In 2024, concentration says, quote, if the effect's creator loses concentration, the effect ends, which means that if concentration on the polymorph spell ended, then the spell would end. But does this also apply to the temporary hit points bestowed by the spell? Because most temporary hit point spells or spells that provide temporary hit points are instantaneous, and the temporary hit points aren't lost immediately as soon as the spell's done because the cast is no longer concentrating on it, if that makes sense. I think I know the answer to this, but either of you see the fault in logic here? Did that make any sense, or was that just complete word spaghetti?
I understood because I was looking at the question. So the question basically
I was trying to find the question.
Polymorph. Yeah, Polymorph says you turn into this creature and you gain temporary hit points equal to the creature's hit points that you turn into. The spell says if you lose those hit points, the spell ends. But it's also a concentration spell, so what happens when the caster loses concentration? Obviously, the spell ends. What are the effects of the spell? The effects of the spell are you turn into this creature and you gain temporary hit points equal to the number of hit points that the creature had. So if the effects end, then that ends and the hit points would end. That's my thought on it. That's how it works at my table. I don't know how it's going to work at everyone's.
The comparison that they use, comparing it to a spell that bestows temporary hit points that has a casting time of instantaneous, like False Life, why don't the temporary hit points disappear immediately because you're not concentrating on the spell? The simple answer is False Life's not a concentration spell, so the temporary hit points last. But Polymorph is a concentration spell, therefore the effects end when concentration is broken.
Otherwise, what happens is I cast that spell on you. You gain 200 temporary hit points because I choose the monster with the most hit points, and then I just end concentration. And I've just created a spell that all I'm doing is giving you a lot of temporary hit points.
It's an example of one of those cases where even if there is a gap in the way it's written, you know what they intended. you can figure out what it meant. You have to do a little bit more backbending to get to the point of breaking it and breaking the game than you would have to do to make it function. And I'm wary of trying to iron out every possible gap in the language, because that's how you end up with some very convoluted, huge paragraphs of text in 5e, because you're trying to use natural language to describe around every possible misuse of a spell or a feature. So I don't know.
Well, a little less so in 2024. They've tried to unnaturalisticize the language a little bit, for better or worse. But if you have a D&D rule quick fix that you need, troubleshooting, you can email podcast@ghostfiregaming.com. and we will troubleshoot your 5e problems or any system. You know what? Send us a Pathfinder question. I'm sure we'd be able to answer it flawlessly. This podcast, if you're listening to it, we appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for being part of this community. Likes, hearts, subscribes, stars, whatever type of response your particular podcasting or YouTube app of choice craves feeds us as well. It's chicken soup for the soul, so to speak, or chicken soup for the podcast. My name's Ben Byrne. We're going to get out of here. And I'm joined, as always, by Shawn Merwin, Dael Kingsmill, James Hake, hopefully back next week, and we will catch you all then for another episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. Ba-ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da-ba-da. Ba-ba-ba-da-ba-ba-da. Dante's the editor.
Ben Byrne is kind of a fun little sequence of
I've been Ben. He just said the same word 3 times.
If I were, with apologies to Rob Hartley, if I was a New Zealander, it would just be, I've been.
Bin. Rob Hartley's not Kiwi, though. He's a Yorkshireman.
But he's, yes. Apologies to other New
Shoebox in
Zealanders.
middle of road.